The invisible prison of self-betrayal. There is a war happening inside you right now, a brutal civil conflict between what you consciously desire and what you unconsciously engineer. You say you want success, recognition, transformation, yet your actions systematically dismantle your own progress, brick by brick, decision by decision, until you stand once again in the ruins of potential, wondering why you cannot escape the patterns that keep you trapped. This is not weakness, not laziness, not bad luck. This is something far more unsettling. The shadow's sabotage, operating beneath your awareness like a government in exile, making decisions without consulting the throne, hijacking your life while you watch in confusion from the sidelines of your own existence. Jung discovered that the unconscious is not a passive storage room for forgotten memories, but a psychological container where rejected traits, unmet needs, and disowned potentials gather autonomous power. These exiled parts do not disappear when you refuse to acknowledge them. They organize into complexes with their own agendas, their own strategies, their own capacity to override your conscious intentions and execute plans you never approved. The entrepreneur who stops posting when their blog finally gains traction is not being irrational. The professional who sabotages the interview they desperately needed is not being careless. The student who freezes on the exam they studied for is not being weak. They are all being ruled by forces they have never examined, voices they have never acknowledged, parts of themselves that believe success is more dangerous than failure, visibility more terrifying than obscurity, greatness more threatening than the familiar comfort of staying small. The paradox is merciless and utterly common. You genuinely want one outcome, the promotion, the relationship, the breakthrough, yet some part of you, hidden in the depths you refuse to explore, wants something else entirely. It wants safety. It wants predictability. It wants the known suffering, because known suffering feels manageable, feels survivable, feels safer than the terror of unknown greatness. Mediocrity is not what happens when you fail to reach for more. It is what happens when the familiar cage feels safer than the open sky, when the prison you know becomes more appealing than the freedom you cannot yet imagine. The bars are invisible, but they are made of fear, shame, unexamined beliefs, and the deep conviction that you are safer staying exactly where you are than risking the exposure that comes with standing tall. Nietzsche saw this gravitational pull with brutal clarity, the invisible social architecture designed to punish deviation and reward conformity. The herd creates a morality that limits everyone to the lowest common denominator, ensuring that no one rises so high that the collective must question its own mediocrity. Your ambition is labeled arrogance. Your difference is treated as threat. Your dreams are dismissed as inappropriate, unrealistic, selfish. The herd does not tolerate greatness because greatness is a mirror reflecting everything the collective has refused to become. And rather than face that mirror, the herd will do everything in its power to shatter it, starting with convincing you that your potential was always an illusion, your ambition always a delusion, your desire to become more always a betrayal of those who need you to stay small so they can feel adequate. The existential question that frames everything, the question that determines whether you live as a monument to what others can tolerate or as a blazing testament to what you actually are, is this: are you sabotaging yourself? Or are you unconsciously defending an identity built on limitation? The answer is not comfortable. The answer demands that you look at parts of yourself you have spent years avoiding. The answer requires that you face the shadow, not as enemy, but as map, not as weakness, but as the key to understanding why you keep ending up in the same place, despite your best intentions, despite your desperate desire for change, despite the mounting evidence that something inside you is working against everything you claim to want. The shadow does not ask permission to rule your life. It only asks whether you will face it consciously and integrate its wisdom, or let it continue to operate from the darkness, engineering your fate while you wonder why life keeps happening to you instead of recognizing that you are happening to yourself. The architecture of self-sabotage, how your shadow constructs failure. Jung's discovery of autonomous complexes was not a theoretical abstraction, but a recognition that within the psyche exist entities with their own agendas, psychological structures that operate like saboteurs, bullying a person into emotional dead ends. These are not mere thoughts you can change through positive affirmations or willpower exercises. They are not beliefs you can simply decide to release. They are psychic entities with independent power, formed when traits, desires, fears, or potentials are rejected by the conscious ego and exiled into the unconscious, where they do not fade quietly into nothingness, but instead gather strength, organizing themselves into coherent forces capable of overriding your rational intentions and executing strategies you would never consciously approve. The mechanism of the split-off self operates with devastating precision. What you reject does not disappear, gains independent power, and manifests as inexplicable procrastination at the worst possible moment, self-destructive decisions that make no logical sense, sudden loss of motivation precisely when breakthrough is within reach. The part of you that craves recognition, but was punished for seeking it as a child, does not vanish when you grow up. It becomes a complex that sabotages every opportunity for visibility, ensuring you stay hidden, safe, small. The part of you that felt abandoned when you needed support does not heal through denial. It becomes an autonomous force that engineers abandonment in every relationship, proving again and again that you are right to expect betrayal, right to protect yourself by never fully opening, right to keep everyone at arm's length because closeness has always led to pain. When your unconscious has more votes than your conscious mind, the illusion of rational control collapses like a house built on sand. Most decisions do not emerge from the rational, conscious part of you that sets goals and makes plans. They emerge from depths you have never examined, driven by voices you have never acknowledged, serving agendas you would never consciously choose. You say you want the promotion, but the complex that believes success equals danger, visibility equals exposure, and exposure equals annihilation, has already decided you will sabotage the interview. You claim you want love, but the complex that equates vulnerability with abandonment and intimacy with eventual betrayal has already ensured you will push away anyone who gets too close, anyone who threatens to actually see you, anyone who might stay long enough to discover that you are not who you pretend to be. Real-world manifestation of these autonomous complexes is everywhere once you learn to see the pattern. The person who sabotages the job opportunity they desperately wanted, who shows up late to the interview or forgets crucial documents, or suddenly becomes ill on the day that matters most, is not irrational or self-destructive by choice. They are being ruled by a complex that believes success equals exposure, and exposure equals the unbearable scrutiny of being seen, judged, found wanting. The entrepreneur who stops posting when their blog gains traction, who goes silent precisely when momentum builds, who abandons the project just as it begins to succeed, is not lazy or lacking discipline. They are obeying an unconscious command that visibility threatens survival, that being noticed invites attack, that staying hidden is the only way to stay safe. The student who fails the exam they studied for, whose mind goes blank despite knowing the material, who makes careless mistakes that contradict their preparation, is not stupid or inadequate. They are enacting a script written by a part of themselves that believes intelligence provokes envy. Success creates distance, and mediocrity is the price of belonging. The core truth Jung offered is unforgiving and impossible to escape once you understand it. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. Your unexamined shadow does not stay hidden in some harmless corner of your mind where it can be safely ignored. It becomes your circumstances, your patterns, your repeated failures, the inexplicable string of bad luck that is not luck at all, but the shadow's meticulous construction of the reality it believes you deserve. The reality it believes will keep you safe. The architecture of self-sabotage is not external, not imposed by others, not the result of circumstances beyond your control. It is internal, autonomous, and devastatingly effective at keeping you exactly where your unconscious believes you belong, exactly where it has decided you must stay to avoid the dangers it sees in becoming more, in being seen, in claiming the life you say you want, but some part of you is convinced will destroy you if you ever actually achieve it. The upper limit problem, your psychological thermostat for tolerating success. There is a subconscious ceiling you hit repeatedly, an invisible barrier that materializes precisely when life exceeds your internal tolerance for happiness, success, or love. Gay Hendricks identified this phenomenon as the upper limit problem. You unconsciously engineer disasters when life exceeds your psychological thermostat, not because you lack discipline, talent, or opportunity, but because success creates unbearable dissonance with your core identity. This is not a failure of willpower or commitment. It is a deeply embedded mechanism designed to keep you within the boundaries of what feels safe, familiar, and congruent with who you believe you are allowed to be. The upper limit strikes when things are going well, not when they are falling apart, and that timing is the signature of its operation. The fear of outshining is one of the most devastating psychological forces most people never consciously recognize. Yet it shapes every decision they make about how high they will allow themselves to rise. There is a deep terror that your success will alienate you from your tribe, family, or social circle, that by rising above, you will be cast out, envied, resented, or abandoned. Staying small keeps you safe from the unbearable possibility of being alone at the top, of having everything you wanted, but no one to share it with, because everyone you love now looks at you with suspicion, jealousy, or the quiet resentment of those who stayed behind. The unconscious does the brutal math. Better to fail and keep your people than to succeed and lose them. Better to stay mediocre and belong than to become exceptional and be exiled from the only community you have ever known. Self-worth functions as the invisible governor of your life, the psychological thermostat that determines how much success, love, and happiness you will allow yourself to experience before you unconsciously pull the emergency brake and restore yourself to baseline. If your core self-concept is, "I am fundamentally flawed," if the deepest belief you hold about yourself is that you are broken, unworthy, or inherently inadequate, then success creates cognitive dissonance so intense that failure becomes psychologically necessary. Your external reality contradicts your internal identity, and the psyche will always choose internal coherence over external achievement. Failure realigns reality with your identity, restoring the psychological equilibrium, even as it destroys your external circumstances, even as it confirms the very unworthiness you have been trying so desperately to escape. The pattern becomes predictable once you learn to recognize its signature. Rapid growth triggers stress, illness, relationship conflicts, or sudden accidents that restore you to your comfort baseline with surgical precision. You finally get the promotion you have been working toward for years, and suddenly you pick a devastating fight with your partner over something trivial, something that would not have mattered yesterday, but today feels unbearable. The business takes off beyond your projections, and you develop mysterious health problems that force you to slow down, step back, return to the familiar rhythm of struggle. The relationship deepens into real intimacy, and you sabotage it with suspicion, withdrawal, or the sudden conviction that something must be wrong, because nothing this good has ever lasted before. So why would it last now? These are not coincidences, not unrelated events, not bad timing. They are your psyche's alarm system, signaling that you have exceeded your internal quota for goodness and must be brought back down to avoid the terror of sustained success, sustained happiness, sustained experience of being more than you believe you deserve to be. The cost of the upper limit is not just the immediate loss of the opportunity you sabotaged. It is the reinforcement of the belief that you are unworthy of success, the deepening of the prison with every manufactured crisis, every self-engineered return to baseline. You are not just avoiding success in the moment. You are teaching yourself that the ceiling is real, that you were right to fear rising higher. That staying small is the only sustainable strategy, because every time you tried to exceed your limit, disaster followed. Each time you hit the upper limit and retreat, you write another chapter in the story of your unworthiness. You add another brick to the wall that separates you from the life you claim to want. You prove to yourself once again that mediocrity is not a choice, but a destiny. Not a pattern, but a fixed reality you can never escape, because the thermostat has been set and you do not know how to reset it. Do not know that it can be reset. Do not know that the limit is not external, but internal. And therefore within your power to change, if only you were willing to face the terror of sustained aliveness. Sustained success, sustained experience of being worthy of the goodness life is trying to give you. Secondary gains, the hidden payoffs of staying mediocre. The counterintuitive truth about mediocrity is that it is not just what happens when you fail. It is often what you are unconsciously choosing because it serves hidden psychological needs that feel more valuable to your shadow than any external achievement ever could. Secondary gains are the covert benefits you receive from staying small. Benefits so psychologically valuable that your unconscious will sabotage overt success to preserve them. This is the shadow's dark bargain, the transaction happening beneath your awareness. You get to keep the comfort, the excuses, the familiar identity, the protective shields you have built around your vulnerability. And in exchange, you surrender your potential, your dreams, your claim to a life that matters. Your right to discover what you are actually capable of when you stop hiding behind the story of limitation. Common secondary gains of self-sabotage are devastatingly effective at keeping you trapped in patterns you claim to want to escape. Mediocrity allows you to avoid responsibility if you never truly try. You never have to own the outcome or face the possibility that your best effort was not enough, that you gave everything and still fell short. It maintains your victim identity, which secures sympathy, attention, and a ready explanation for why life has not delivered what you deserve, why others succeeded where you failed, why the world has been unfair to you specifically. It dodges the terror of being visible, the scrutiny that comes with success, the weight of expectations you fear you cannot sustain, the unbearable pressure of having to continue delivering, growing, being extraordinary once everyone is watching and waiting for you to fail. It preserves familiar routines, the comfortable rhythms of a life that makes no demands on your courage, your growth, your willingness to risk failure in pursuit of something meaningful, something that might actually matter when you reach the end and look back at what you did with the time you were given. The comfort of low expectations is a seductive trap that feels like wisdom, like realism, like finally accepting who you are instead of chasing delusions of grandeur. When you set the bar low, you always feel exceptional relative to the minimal standard you have established. Mediocrity becomes a strategy to avoid the risk of genuine effort and genuine failure. If you never reach for greatness, you never have to confront the painful truth of whether you are capable of it. The secondary gain is protection from disappointment, from the shattering of the fantasy that you could have, if only. The fantasy is preserved by never testing it, and the cost is a life spent wondering what might have been if you had only dared, if you had only tried, if you had only believed that you were worth the risk of finding out what you were actually capable of. Beneath the armor of self-protection and strategic limitation, the grieving required to change is real and cannot be bypassed, cannot be shortcut, cannot be avoided if transformation is to be genuine rather than performative. To leave mediocrity, you must mourn what you lose, the comfort of the known, the excuses that have defined you and given shape to your identity, the familiar story that has allowed you to avoid the full weight of your own agency and the terrifying responsibility that comes with admitting you have always had more power than you were willing to claim. This is not a small loss, not a trivial sacrifice. It is the death of a version of yourself that has served as refuge, however limiting that refuge has been. The shadow clings to these gains because they are real benefits, even if they cost you everything you could have become. The excuses protected you. The victim identity connected you to others who understood your pain. The low expectations shielded you from the crushing weight of possibility. Letting them go means standing naked in the unknown, exposed to the full force of your own potential, and then the unbearable question of what you will do with it now that you can no longer hide behind the story of why you cannot. Freud's death drive, the pull towards psychological entropy. Thanatos is Freud's most controversial and unsettling discovery. The recognition that within us exists not just a will to live, not just eros, driving us toward connection, growth, and vitality, but a fundamental drive toward dissolution, repetition of trauma, and return to inorganic stasis. This is not simply a lack of life force or vitality, not merely the absence of motivation or energy. It is an active pull toward psychological entropy, a compulsion that seeks not growth but regression, not aliveness but the safety of nothingness, not becoming but unbecoming. Thanatos is the shadow's darkest face, the part of you that does not want to heal, grow, or thrive, but to dissolve back into the silence that preceded existence, back into the state where there were no demands, no expectations, no unbearable weight of consciousness and choice. Why people repeat what damages them becomes comprehensible only through the lens of the death drive, through understanding that the compulsion to recreate painful relationships, to enter doomed situations, to engage in self-harmful behaviors that violate even the pleasure principle is not accidental, not irrational, not the result of poor judgment or lack of awareness. The child who is abandoned seeks abandoning partners with uncanny precision, not because they are masochistic or because they enjoy pain, but because the repetition offers the unconscious a desperate hope of mastering the original trauma, of rewriting the ending, of proving that this time it will be different, even though the repetition only deepens the wound, only confirms the original fear, only strengthens the belief that abandonment is inevitable and intimacy is always temporary. The adult who is criticized seeks critical environments with the same magnetic pull, gravitating toward bosses, partners, friends who mirror the original wounding because criticism is familiar, and the death drive prefers the known pain to the unknown terror of being loved, valued, celebrated for who you actually are, rather than punished for who you failed to be. Mediocrity as a form of slow death is not dramatic, not visible, not the kind of ending that makes headlines or leaves evidence. But it is death nonetheless, the gradual suffocation of potential, the choosing of numbness over aliveness, safety over growth, the known suffering over the unknown possibility of becoming something more. Freud argued that Thanatos does not seek dramatic endings, does not push you toward suicide or visible self-destruction in most cases, but toward the quiet erosion of vitality, the retreat into routines that feel like life, but are actually death by 1,000 compromises, 1,000 moments of choosing comfort over courage, predictability over risk, the cage over the open sky. This is the death that happens while you are still breathing, still going through the motions, still pretending that existence and aliveness are the same thing when they have not been the same for years. Maybe decades, maybe since the moment you first learned that wanting more, being more, reaching for more was dangerous and staying small was the only way to survive. The evidence in modern life is everywhere, once you learn to see it. Once you understand that Thanatos is not an abstract concept, but a living force expressing itself in countless daily choices that lead not toward expansion but contraction, not toward aliveness but slow dissolution. Addiction is Thanatos in slow motion, the choosing of chemical peace over the unbearable intensity of being alive and conscious. The preference for numbness over feeling, because feeling means facing everything you have been running from, everything the substance temporarily allows you to forget. Procrastination is Thanatos disguised as rest. The refusal to act, not because you lack energy, but because action demands aliveness. Engagement, presence, and aliveness is terrifying when you have spent so long in the comfortable fog of not quite living, not quite dead, suspended in the gray space between potential and its deliberate abandonment. Staying in toxic relationships is Thanatos seeking the familiar pain of the past, because the pain is predictable, and predictability feels safer than the risk of unknown happiness, unknown intimacy, unknown experience of being chosen, valued, loved in ways that contradict everything your history has taught you to expect. Abandoning goals right before success is Thanatos pulling you back to the baseline of limitation, because limitation is what you know. Safety is what you trust, and what you might become if you actually succeeded is more threatening than the comfortable misery of failure. You have learned to navigate, learned to survive, learned to mistake for the only life available to someone like you. The integration of the death drive is the only path forward, the only way to transform Thanatos from destroyer of potential into catalyst for genuine rebirth. You cannot eliminate the death drive. It is woven into the fabric of the psyche, an essential counterbalance to Eros, a necessary force that exists whether you acknowledge it or not. But you can redirect it, consciously choosing what it destroys instead of allowing it to destroy you by default. By unconscious operation, by the slow erosion that happens when you refuse to face what is happening in the depths. Let the death drive destroy not your potential, but your false self. Not your dreams, but your limiting beliefs. Not your courage, but your attachment to comfort and conformity. Let Thanatos burn away what no longer serves you, what keeps you small, what binds you to a life you have outgrown, but lack the courage to leave, because leaving would mean admitting that you have been complicit in your own limitation, that the cage has been unlocked all along, and you simply chose not to open the door. This is the paradox that liberates. To truly live, something in you must die, but you get to choose what. The death drive, when integrated consciously rather than allowed to operate in shadow, becomes the fire of transformation rather than the slow suffocation of mediocrity. The force that clears the ground for new growth, rather than the weight that buries you alive in the grave you dug one. Compromise at a time, one retreat at a time, one moment at a time, when you chose the comfort of not trying over the terror of discovering what you might be capable of if you stopped letting Thanatos write the ending before the story truly begins. The herd's morality, Nietzsche's warning about collective mediocrity. Herd morality is a system of control, not wisdom, not the result of collective enlightenment or evolved understanding of human flourishing, but a mechanism designed to ensure that no one rises so high that the collective must question its own mediocrity. The collective creates values that limit everyone to the lowest common denominator, establishing rules and norms that make excellence dangerous, ambition suspicious, indifference a threat to the fragile equilibrium that keeps the herd stable, predictable, manageable. Humility over confidence, modesty over ambition, equality over excellence. These are not virtues discovered through reflection or philosophical inquiry, but strategies for maintaining group cohesion, for ensuring that the exceptional are brought down to the level of the average so that the average never has to face the unbearable question of what they could have become if they had only tried, if they had only risked, if they had only refused to accept the herd's insistence that we are all that you same and dreaming of more is a betrayal of those who have settled for less. Why mediocrity attacks greatness becomes clear when you understand the mechanism is not wisdom, but self-preservation, not concern for the individual, but protection of the collective's comfort. What the herd cannot understand or achieve, it seeks to destroy, not through overt violence or dramatic confrontation, but through subtle mechanisms that are far more effective because they operate beneath conscious awareness. Judgment whispered in private conversations, gossip that spreads like infection, the withdrawal of approval that feels like social death, the quiet insistence that your dreams are too big, your ambitions inappropriate, your difference wrong in ways that are never quite articulated, but always deeply felt. The herd does not need to physically destroy you. It only needs to make the cost of deviation so unbearable that you police yourself, dimming your light before anyone asks, shrinking your goals to fit the group's comfort, apologizing for your talents as if they were crimes against the collective, as if being capable of more is an insult to those who have chosen to be capable of less. The internalization of limitation is the herd's greatest victory. The moment when external control becomes internal conviction, when the voice of the collective becomes your own voice speaking inside your head with your tone, your accent, your authority. You begin believing your dreams are too big, your ambitions inappropriate, your difference wrong. The herd gets another conformist, not by force, but by convincing you to betray yourself, to become your own jailer, to enforce the herd's values more ruthlessly than any external authority could, because you now believe these limitations are not imposed but chosen, not restrictions but wisdom, not fear but realism. The herd morality gets inside your head and speaks with your voice, whispering that excellence is arrogance, that ambition is selfishness, that standing apart is betrayal of those who need you to stay small so they can feel adequate, so they can tell themselves that mediocrity is not a choice, but a destiny, not a failure, but the natural order that no one can escape without becoming something monstrous, something dangerous, something that must be brought back down for the good of everyone. The self-fulfilling prophecy completes the cycle with brutal efficiency, ensuring that the herd's beliefs about limitation become the reality that proves those beliefs were correct all along. By rejecting difference, the herd ensures it remains mediocre. No one rises because no one is allowed to rise without punishment, without the withdrawal of belonging, without the devastating experience of achieving what you wanted, only to discover that the price was losing everyone who mattered, everyone who knew you when you were still one of them, still safe, still small. By fearing judgment, you ensure you will never threaten the group's balance, never disrupt the comfortable equilibrium of collective limitation, where everyone agrees that reaching for more is foolish, dangerous evidence of delusion rather than courage. The herd stays mediocre, and you stay small, and everyone tells themselves this is wisdom, this is humility, this is community, when in truth it is only fear disguised as virtue, limitation masquerading as connection, the collective agreement to pull down anyone who threatens to prove that more was always possible, required a courage the herd refuses to summon. The price of belonging is steep and non-negotiable, paid in daily increments so small you barely notice until you look back and realize what you sacrificed, what you abandoned, what you killed in yourself to keep your place in a group that demanded your diminishment as the cost of acceptance. Your talents suffocated before they could fully develop, your potential sacrificed at the altar of social acceptance before you could discover what you were actually capable of. Your life reduced to a monument to what others can tolerate, rather than a testament to what you could have become. Nietzsche's warning cuts through every comfortable illusion. The ideas of the herd should rule in the herd, but they should not reach out beyond it. The higher individual must pay no attention to the herd's claims of universality, its insistence that its values apply to everyone, its moral demands that disguise fear as wisdom and limitation as love. The herd will call this arrogance, will insist that you are abandoning your responsibility to the group, will frame your desire for more as a betrayal of those who need you to stay less. But the truth is simpler and more brutal. The herd fears your greatness, because your greatness is a mirror reflecting everything they have refused to become, every choice they made to stay safe instead of grow, every dream they abandoned because dreaming was too painful when they had already decided the dream was impossible. Rather than face that mirror, rather than confront what they gave up and why, they will do everything in their power to shatter it, starting with convincing you that the mirror was always a lie, that your potential was always delusion, that the only sane choice is to stay exactly where they are, trapped in the comfortable prison of collective mediocrity, where at least no one has to face the unbearable truth of what they could have been if they had only dared to walk away from the herd. And Discover who they were when no one was watching, when no one was judging, when the only voice that mattered was the one they spent a lifetime learning to ignore. The fear of the unknown. Why mediocrity feels safer than greatness. The psychological architecture of the comfort zone is built on an ancient equation that made perfect sense for survival in a world of immediate physical threats, but becomes a prison in a world where the greatest dangers are not to the body, but to the unlived life. Known suffering versus unknown possibility, the brain, shaped by millions of years of evolution, where predictability meant survival and uncertainty meant potential death, prefers predictable pain over uncertain reward. This wiring does not distinguish between the danger of a predator and the risk of becoming visible, powerful, or successful. It registers uncertainty as threat and mobilizes the fear response to keep you within the boundaries of the familiar, even when the familiar is slowly killing you, even when the known suffering has become unbearable, but still feels more manageable than the terror of stepping into the unknown, where you cannot predict what will happen, cannot control the outcome, cannot guarantee that the risk will be worth the cost. Identity threat is the deepest fear underlying the comfort zone, more fundamental than fear of failure or fear of judgment, more paralyzing than any external obstacle. Becoming great means becoming someone you do not recognize, shedding the familiar failed self that has been your companion through every disappointment and setback. Every moment when you prove to yourself once again that you are right to expect less, right to settle, right to stop reaching for what seemed impossible. That failed self feels more real than the potential successful self because you have lived with it longer, know its contours, can predict its reactions, understand its limits. To let it die is to step into an identity void where you do not yet know who you will become, where the old strategies no longer work, but the new ones have not yet formed, where you are suspended in the terrifying space between who you were and who you might be if you can survive the transformation without retreating back to the familiar baseline of disappointment and the strange comfort of knowing exactly who you are, even if who you are is someone who has given up on becoming more. The terror of visibility keeps more people trapped than any lack of talent, opportunity, or resources, more effectively than any external barrier or systemic injustice. Mediocrity allows you to hide in the crowd, to avoid the scrutiny that comes with success, the criticism that accompanies achievement, the envy that follows excellence, the unbearable weight of expectations that you will continue to deliver, to grow, to be extraordinary, not just once, but consistently, relentlessly, without the luxury of retreat or the permission to fail, now that everyone is watching and waiting for you to prove that you are always a fraud, always an imposter, always someone who got lucky once, but will inevitably be revealed as unworthy of the success you accidentally stumbled into. Greatness exposes you to judgment, not just from others, but from yourself. The relentless inner voice that asks whether you truly deserve what you have achieved or whether you are an imposter waiting to be unmasked, a fraud whose luck will eventually run out and whose inadequacy will finally be revealed for all to see, confirming what you suspected all along, that you are never supposed to be here, never supposed to rise this high, never supposed to claim this much space in a world that belongs to people more talented, more deserving, more fundamentally worthy than you could ever be. Risk aversion becomes existential paralysis, the refusal to blaze a trail in favor of walking the trodden path, the choosing of guaranteed disappointment over possible failure, because guaranteed disappointment is at least predictable, manageable, something you know how to survive. It is easier to follow the map than to draw your own, easier to repeat what has been done than to attempt what has never been tried, easier to settle for the life you can predict than to risk the life you cannot yet imagine but might discover. If you are willing to walk into the unknown without a guarantee, without a safety net, without the comfort of knowing that even if it does not work out, you can at least say you tried when the truth is you never really gave it everything, because giving everything would have meant risking the discovery that everything was not enough. And that discovery would have shattered the last protective illusion, the final shield between you and the full weight of being alive, conscious, responsible for what you make of the singular, unrepeatable gift of existence that will end whether you spent it hiding or reaching, playing it safe or risking everything for the possibility of becoming who you were always capable of being beneath the armor of fear and strategic limitation. The truth about safety is that the comfort zone is not safe. It is where dreams go to die slowly, where potential rots in the dark, where you become a ghost of what you could have been, haunting the life you are too afraid to fully inhabit. The known suffering is still suffering. It simply has the advantage of familiarity, the cold comfort of predictability, the illusion that you are choosing this limitation, when in truth you are only choosing to avoid the alternative. Choosing the cage because you have convinced yourself the open sky is more dangerous than the bars you know how to navigate. The comfort zone is a trap disguised as refuge, and the longer you stay, the more you mistake the bars for walls meant to protect you rather than confine you. The more you tell yourself that this is wisdom, this is realism, this is acceptance of who you are, when it is only fear disguised as self-knowledge. Limitation masquerading as authenticity. Mediocrity is not the absence of risk. It is the guarantee of a specific outcome, a life unlived, a potential unrealized, a self betrayed in exchange for the illusion that you are keeping yourself safe, when in truth you are only keeping yourself small, contained, manageable, dead in all the ways that matter, while your body continues going through motions that stopped meaning anything the day you decided that the unknown was too terrifying to face, and the known suffering was at least something. You understood, something you could survive, something that did not demand you become more than you have been, more than you know how to be, more than the part of you that is terrified of aliveness will ever allow you to become, as long as you keep listening to its whispers. That safety and stagnation are the same thing, that the comfort zone and the grave are fundamentally different when they are only separated by the question of whether your heart is still beating while you wait for permission that will never come to finally start living. Breaking the pattern, the shadow work that liberates. Jung's path of individuation is the lifelong process of integrating all aspects of yourself, especially the rejected parts, to become whole and authentic, not whole in the sense of perfection or the absence of conflict, but whole in the sense of no longer being at war with yourself, no longer exiling parts of your psyche into the shadows where they gather autonomous power and sabotage your conscious intentions. This is not self-improvement in the shallow sense of becoming a better version of the persona you present to the world, not the cosmetic work of polishing the mask until it shines more brightly. It is psychological archaeology, the excavation of the shadow to discover what has been exiled and why. The courageous work of reclaiming those parts so they no longer rule you from the darkness, so they no longer hijack your decisions and construct the circumstances you claim to want to escape, but keep recreating with uncanny precision because the shadow has an agenda you have never acknowledged and power you have never challenged. Confronting the shadow consciously is not done through force or denial, not through positive thinking or the willful suppression of what you find unacceptable, but through honest acknowledgement that cuts through every defense and every comfortable lie you have told yourself about who you are and why you do what you do. What traits, desires, fears, and potentials have you disowned because they were punished, mocked, or rejected when you first dared to express them? What parts of yourself did you bury because expressing them felt dangerous, because the herd would not tolerate them, because your family could not accept them, because the world insisted they were wrong, and you learned to agree rather than face the unbearable isolation of standing alone in your truth? The shadow does not ask for perfection or demand that you become someone you are not. It asks only for recognition, for the willingness to see what you have spent years, maybe decades, maybe your entire life hiding from yourself and from the world, because seeing it would mean facing the grief of Everything you sacrificed to belong, everything you abandoned to be loved, everything you killed in yourself to survive in a world that rewarded conformity and punished authenticity. The practice of making the unconscious conscious is the heart of shadow work, the daily discipline of turning attention inward, not to judge or fix, but to observe, to notice, to become curious about the patterns that repeat despite your best intentions. This involves journaling patterns of self-sabotage without the comforting narratives that excuse or explain them away, examining where you consistently fail and asking what hidden belief might be driving the behavior, what secondary gain might be preserved by the failure, what identity might be threatened by the success you claim to want, but keep engineering circumstances to avoid. It means sitting with discomfort rather than numbing it with distraction, substance, or the endless scroll of content designed to keep you from ever being alone with your thoughts long enough to hear what the shadow is trying to say. It requires noticing when the shadow speaks, the sudden loss of motivation, the inexplicable procrastination, a self-destructive impulse that makes no rational sense, and learning to distinguish its voice from your conscious intentions, to recognize that you are not one unified self, but a collection of parts, some conscious and some operating in darkness, and the parts operating in darkness are not your enemies, but aspects of yourself that have been rejected and are now demanding to be seen, heard, integrated, rather than continually exiled. This work requires the humility to admit that you do not know yourself as well as you think, that the persona you present to the world and even the self-concept you hold privately are both incomplete, both filtered through defenses that formed so long ago you can no longer remember why they were necessary or recognize that they have become the cage you mistake for identity. It demands the courage to discover what lies beneath the persona you have been defending, what waits in the depths you have avoided exploring, because exploring them would mean confronting the grief of who you might have been if you had not learned so early to hide, to shrink, to apologize for taking up space, for wanting more, for being different in ways that threatened those who needed you to stay small so they could feel adequate. Small acts of courage are the building blocks of transformation, the daily practice of choosing discomfort over comfort, action over paralysis, truth over the seductive lies that keep you trapped in familiar patterns. The goal is not perfection, not the dramatic transformation that happens overnight and erases every struggle, but demonstrating to yourself that you can act despite fear, that you can exceed your upper limit and survive the discomfort of sustained success, that you can tolerate visibility and the weight of expectations without self-destructing, without sabotaging what you built, without retreating back to the baseline where at least you knew who you were, even if who you were was someone who had given up. Each small step rewires the nervous system, teaching the shadow that greatness is not death, that success does not equal abandonment, that becoming more does not mean losing yourself, but finally finding yourself beneath the layers of adaptation and defense that formed to protect a version of you that no longer exists, but whose strategies still run your life because you never consciously chose to update them, to question whether they still serve you, or whether they are now the primary obstacle between who you are and who you could become. The transformation that shadow work offers is not the elimination of the saboteur, but its conversion from enemy to ally, from unconscious driver to conscious advisor, whose warnings you can hear and evaluate rather than unconsciously obey. Shadow work does not eliminate the saboteur. It transforms it by bringing it into consciousness, by understanding its origins and its intentions, by recognizing that it formed to protect you and is still trying to protect you, even when its protection has become the prison. The fear that once stopped you becomes the compass pointing toward what matters most, the signal that you are approaching something significant, something that threatens the old identity and therefore provokes resistance from the parts of you invested in keeping everything exactly as it has always been. The self-doubt that once silenced you becomes the question that refines your purpose and sharpens your clarity, the invitation to examine whether you truly want what you say you want, or whether you are pursuing someone else's definition of success, someone else's vision of what your life should look like. The autonomous complex that once hijacked your decisions becomes a trusted advisor, its warnings heeded but not obeyed blindly, its concerns acknowledged but not allowed to veto every risk, every reach, every attempt to become more than you have been. This is the promise of individuation, not a perfect life free of conflict, doubt, or struggle, but a conscious life where you are no longer ruled by forces you refuse to see, but guided by the fullness of who you actually are. Shadow and light integrated, potential and limitation acknowledged, a whole self finally claiming its rightful place in your own story instead of living as a fragment, a persona, a carefully constructed mask designed to please others, while the real you withers in the darkness, waiting for permission that will never come to finally step into the light and discover what you are capable of when you stop hiding from yourself. Stop running from the shadow. Stop pretending that wholeness means perfection when it only means the courage to be completely, authentically, unapologetically yourself, flawed, afraid, uncertain, but finally, blessedly, fully alive. The choice between two paths. The two paths you face are not metaphors, not philosophical abstractions to be pondered in comfortable distance from their reality. They are the defining choice of your existence, the fork in the road that determines whether the life you live will be a testament to courage or a monument to fear. The first path is the surrender of your potential through mediocrity, the slow suffocation that happens when you choose the comfort zone over the risk, the known suffering over the unknown possibility, the familiar cage over the terrifying freedom of becoming who you actually are beneath the layers of defense and strategic limitation. This path is quiet, socially acceptable, invisible to those who are not paying attention, and utterly devastating to the one walking it. It is the gradual erosion of aliveness until you become a monument to what others could tolerate, a ghost haunting the life you were too afraid to fully inhabit, a collection of compromises and retreats that add up to a singular, unbearable conclusion. You spent your entire existence avoiding the one thing that would have made it worth living, which was the full, undefeated, terrifying experience of being completely yourself, without apology, without permission, without the constant monitoring of whether you were still acceptable to people whose approval you mistook for love. The second path is the transformation through releasing your false self, the shedding of limiting beliefs that have defined you since before you could question whether they were true, the confrontation with the shadow you have spent a lifetime avoiding, the willingness to become someone you do not yet recognize, because who you have been is no longer large enough to contain who you are becoming. This path is terrifying, not because it promises pain you already know pain, have survived it, have made a home in it, but because it offers no guarantees, no map, no assurance that you will succeed, or that the pain of change will be worth the result. It asks only that you trust that becoming whole is worth the cost of leaving behind the fragmented, defended, mediocre version of yourself that has kept you safe but small, comfortable but empty, accepted but fundamentally alone because no one has ever really seen you. How could they when you have never allowed yourself to be fully visible, never stopped performing the role, never risked showing what lies beneath the persona you constructed to survive in a world that rewarded conformity and punished the courage to be different? Jung's final wisdom echoes across the decades with undiminished force, cutting through every comfortable illusion and every protective lie. The process of individuation demands courage to confront your shadows, doubts, and limiting beliefs, to face what you have been running from, not with force or denial, but with honest acknowledgement of what has been exiled and why. Becoming whole requires integrating what you have rejected, the parts of yourself that were punished, the desires that were mocked, the potentials that were dismissed as unrealistic or inappropriate or dangerous to the stability of those who needed you to stay predictable, manageable, contained within boundaries that were never yours, but which you internalized so completely you can no longer distinguish between who you are and who you were trained to be. This work requires facing what you have feared, accepting that the path to authenticity is never easy, never certain, never a straight line from where you are to where you want to be, but a spiral that returns you again and again to the same core wounds, the same patterns, the same choice between retreating to safety and stepping forward into the unknown, with nothing but the fragile hope that you might be capable of more than you have allowed yourself to become. The shadow does not disappear through avoidance or denial. It only asks whether you will face it consciously, integrate it courageously, and let it transform from the architect of your prison into the fuel for your becoming, the raw material for transformation, rather than the force that keeps you trapped in patterns you claim. To want to escape, but keep recreating, because recreating them feels safer than the alternative, which is discovering who you might be if you stopped letting fear write the script, stopped letting the herd determine your limits, stopped letting the wounded child inside you make decisions for the adult you could become if you were willing to turn and face that child with compassion rather than contempt, with curiosity rather than judgment, with the willingness to finally give it what it needed, so it can stop hijacking your present in a desperate attempt to rewrite a past that cannot be changed, but can be integrated, understood, released. Nietzsche's exhortation cuts to the core of the existential choice with surgical precision. Become who you are, not who the herd demands, not who your fear dictates, not who your parents needed you to be, or who society insists is acceptable, but who you actually are, beneath the layers of defense and conformity, beneath the persona and the performance, and the carefully constructed mask you wear so consistently you have forgotten it is a mask and mistaken it for your face. This is not a call to arrogance, but to authenticity, not a demand for perfection, but an invitation to courage, to the radical act of claiming your own life as your own, rather than living as a character in someone else's story, playing a role someone else wrote, pursuing goals someone else defined as valuable, while the dreams that actually matter to you fade quietly in the darkness because you never gave them permission to live, never believed they were worth the risk, never trusted that you deserve to want what you actually want, rather than what you have been trained to accept as enough. The herd will not understand this choice. How could they, when understanding would mean questioning their own choices, facing their own shadows, admitting that they too settled for less than they were capable of, and convinced themselves it was wisdom rather than fear? A comfort zone will resist with every weapon in its arsenal doubt. Procrastination, the sudden emergence of every obstacle, an excuse you have ever used to avoid taking the leap. A shadow will test you, will engineer crises at precisely the moments when you are making progress, will pull you back toward the baseline with a force that feels insurmountable because it is the accumulated weight of every choice you have made to stay safe, every moment you chose comfort over courage, every time you retreated when you could have advanced. But the alternative is a life spent as a ghost of your own potential, a monument to fear disguised as wisdom, a testament to everything you could have been if only you had dared to face what you were running from, if only you had trusted that you were worth the risk, if only you had believed that becoming who you actually are was more important than remaining who everyone else needed you to be. The price and the reward are both absolute, non-negotiable, laid out before you with brutal clarity. Mediocrity costs you everything you could have been, every dream deferred until it fossilized into regret, every talent left dormant because using it felt too dangerous, every moment of aliveness traded for the safety of the known, every relationship kept at surface level because depth required vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of being hurt again the way you were hurt before. The cost compounds forever, accumulating interest on unfulfilled potential until the weight becomes unbearable, until you look back at the end and realize that the life you lived was not yours, but a performance, a compromise, a long, slow retreat from everything that mattered in exchange for a safety that was never real, a comfort that was only numbness, an acceptance that required you to betray yourself so completely you can no longer remember who you were before you learned to hide. Transformation costs you only the illusions you have been defending, the belief that you are too small, too broken, too unworthy to claim the life you are capable of all alone. The story that your limitations are fixed rather than chosen. The conviction that staying safe is the same as staying alive when they are opposites. When safety without aliveness is only a slower form of fading. One cost compounds forever into a life of quiet desperation and mounting regret. The other is paid once, in a single choice repeated daily, in the moment-by-moment decision to face fear rather than obey it, to act despite uncertainty rather than wait for permission, to become rather than remain. This payment opens the door to everything you have been avoiding, not because what you were avoiding was easy, but because what you were avoiding was real, was yours, was the only thing that could ever make the struggle worth it, because it was chosen rather than inherited, created rather than accepted, lived rather than endured. The final question is yours to answer, and no one can answer it for you. No one can make the choice on your behalf. No one can walk through the door that only you can open. Will you sabotage yourself into comfort, into the familiar patterns and the known suffering and the slow fading of potential? That asks nothing of you except that you continue to accept less than you are capable of, less than you deserve, less than the part of you that is still alive knows is possible. Or will you honor the terrifying call of your own potential, the whisper that has never stopped speaking, even when you tried to silence it, the voice that insists you are capable of more than you have allowed yourself to become, that the cage is unlocked, that the only thing keeping you small is the choice you make every day to stay exactly where you are, because leaving would mean facing everything you have been avoiding and discovering whether you have the courage to become who you actually are when no one is watching, when no one is judging, when the only voice that matters is the one you have spent a lifetime learning to ignore. The shadow does not disappear, it only asks whether you will face it consciously or let it rule you from the darkness, whether you will integrate its wisdom or continue to be sabotaged by its autonomous operation, whether you will transform it from enemy to ally or spend your remaining days fighting a battle you can never win, because you are fighting yourself. The choice is not between success and failure, not between happiness and suffering, but between two versions of yourself, the one who stayed safe, who chose the cage, who spent a lifetime wondering what might have been and left this world with the music still inside, with the potential still locked away, with the dreams still waiting for permission that never came, and the one who dared to see what they were truly capable of, who faced the shadow and discovered not a monster but a map, who chose the terrifying freedom of becoming over the comfortable prison of staying exactly where fear insisted they belong, who lived not perfectly but fully, not without struggle, but with the deep satisfaction of knowing that when the end came, they had at least tried, they had at least risked, they had at least honored the singular, unrepeatable gift of existence by refusing to fade before their time, by choosing aliveness over safety, becoming over remaining, the terrifying freedom of truth over the comfortable prison of illusion.